So, Kay Ming, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited for this. I saw the book in the previews. I think I read the Millions, the website. It does like the giant preview of every book coming out. And this was one that like, when you right click, open a new tab, this book was like gonna be, and I saw it like as early on. And so I was like anticipating it. And then it absolutely lived up to my expectations too. So I'm so excited.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you. No, thank you so much.
Yeah, I love myth making. I love your prose. I love all of this. So we'll get into the details. Do you have your book handy? And could you read just a really short bit, like a paragraph or two, to introduce your style in case someone here hasn't yet read your book?
Yes, I have my ARC here. I can read. Ooh, maybe I'll read just the first paragraph of the book. Yeah, so this takes place, or actually I'll just say that it's from the perspective of the mother in the book. Journey to the West, Part 1. Or a story of warning for my only daughter. Moral, don't bury anything. Ba doesn't know where he buried the gold. Ma chases him around and beats him with her soup ladle. You've never been to a funeral, but this is what it looks like. 4 of us in the backyard, digging where our shadows have died. A shovel for Ba, a soup ladle for Ma, a spoon for me and Jia to share. We dig with what we don't want. Piss buckets, a stolen plunger, the hands we pray with. We even use the spatulas gifted to us by the church ladies after their days-long debate about whether Orientals even used spatulas. It was decided that we didn't, but that we should. Hence our collection of them, different sizes and metals and colors. Ma mistook them for fly swatters. She used them to spank us, selecting a spatula based on the severity of our crime. Be glad I only used my 2 hands on you. So that's the first paragraph of the book from the mother's perspective.
It's so good. I love your prose style. So great. So my first series of questions is about style. So you're also a poet.
Yeah.
I guess I would say that. So that's important to know for my first question, which is, how does your poetry influence your prose and sort of vice versa? Did one come first, one later? I'm sort of interested in the relationship between the two.
That's really funny because I always say that I accidentally wrote a novel, which I realize is extremely like fortuitous and a wonderful accident. Because for the longest time, I thought I would only write poetry. And I actually really, like 90% of what I read was poetry too. And so I was working on poems all through my undergrad. And I was taking this class that was like multiple disciplines. It was photography, memoir, and poetry. And I ended up writing a micro memoir piece that was the very first prose piece I'd ever written. And my professor, Rachel Eliza Griffiths, was like, you should expand. You should do this, but like for 50,000 words or so. And I was like, oh, okay. And so it was for this like requirement, because I was there because I was like, oh, I only want to write poetry. I only want to read poetry. But I think interestingly, the two processes feel very similar to me. Like I always kind of let the language lead. And the poetry that I do love to write and read is oftentimes very narrative, and kind of encapsulates very kind of grand creation myths or multiple generations of a family. And so I have that kind of narrative tendency already. I just didn't know it could be harnessed in this other way. Yeah.
That's interesting. I also, my only advice to people asking about how to write novels now, though, is like, do this for 50,000 words.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what role how does revision play into this? So especially if you weren't planning to write a novel, how much of this came out in draft 1? How much of this was a returning to it and honing and refining through a revision process?
I'm really excited about this question because I always say that this book was written entirely in edits. The first draft is completely like there's probably, I don't know, maybe like 10,000 words of the first draft that have remained in some form kind of the same. It was completely, and I'm very lucky to have editors who took on a book that they knew was very much in its like roughest stage, that they knew they had to kind of tear apart at the seams and rewrite. At one point, like I wrote, the draft was like 60,000 words. At one point, I wrote up to like 130,000 words. Like I just wrote a whole other book. And they were like, you need to not do that and just work on what you already have. So it was completely, everything came out in edits. The Tiger Tail initially was probably like 10 pages of the book. It was like this blip of an incident. So the Tiger Tail became kind of the thread throughout the whole book. The relationship between Ben and daughter, which also is kind of a spine of the book, was also just kind of a blip. It was a very brief chapter. I couldn't really imagine a future for them. It was my own kind of transformative process and imaginative journey, I think, that allowed me to develop all these things. Like half the book was about the grandfather in the first draft. I also tell people that the first chapter of the book used to be the last chapter of the book, and it was that way for a very long time, for probably over a year. The very first chapter was the last chapter because it was actually the last thing that I wrote. So I think in my mind, I was like, well, I wrote it in this order, therefore it is this order. And everybody was like, no, 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 no. They're like, wait a second, like that, just because certain things came to you first doesn't mean that you're kind of stuck in that or like cemented into that. Like there are so many other possibilities. So basically everything was written in edits. Yeah.
So one of the things I really loved about it was that when I started, I thought it might be a novel in stories. When I, like the first few chapters, you're bouncing around through time a little bit, you're getting individual stories, and then they sort of thread together in the middle. Again, you mentioned thread, tiger tail together. That's I'm going to use the thing from the book. And then there's a little bit where it felt like it went back to the individual threads and it comes back together again. So it was an interesting structure. And first of all, I love anything that doesn't adhere to, the arc that we're all familiar with. First of all, I say I did draw a diagram of this just to help myself.
Oh, wow.
Back of the next card. I hope this shows up okay. It might not. There we go. That was my personal understanding of the novel. And as I just described, like, how did this, and it became, once I wrote that, it was like, it's a goofy little diagram, but it really did make me say, okay, this is actually a really interesting approach. Did you intentionally like have these separate stories that you wanted to thread together? Like, especially when Ben came in, like there was that, it's like, and it was such a pleasant feeling to go from like, oh, these all just suddenly reached the same point. Was that something you tried in the revision?
Yeah, well, that's funny because originally it was a collection. When I first wrote it and actually queried it to an agent, I actually queried it as a collection of essays, which now when I look back, I'm like, whoa, not essays. But I was really inspired by books like Chinamen by Maxine Hong Kingston, which kind of blend memoir, fiction, fable, and in a very non-chronological way, in a very episodic way. It almost feels like a compilation of things, but they all kind of thematically have these resonances. And so that was kind of what I was envisioning. And I was like, oh, it can be, all of these things. And it was only later that I realized, oh no, I do kind of want there to be momentum, because that was one thing that I was really lacking, and was that each section had its own arc, but there wasn't like a fuller arc throughout them all. And I think, like you were saying, Ben was the character that I think, as I began to write her more and more and kind of expand her presence through the book, she was kind of like the vehicle. This relationship was, a vehicle, and created a lot of momentum. But yeah, I was very interested in like, what would that kind of, I guess maybe momentum is the wrong word, but like movement or flow look like without a very clear kind of linear or like, rising action, falling action, climax, like are very kind of typical understandings, especially kind of Western centric understanding of what a story can look like. I wanted to subvert that because I think the characters themselves kind of embody this different sense of time that's very like divorced from linearity and is very much about being haunted. So that was definitely the Tail and Ben were kind of almost were taking over the book, and I was very glad for it. Yeah.
So focusing a little bit more finally on the language itself, how do you focus on language? What's your goal in crafting language? Are there specific things you look for or try to accomplish when you write on the word, sentence, paragraph, phrase level?
Yeah, I love this question because I feel like it's both the thing, language is what draws me to the page, and it's also kind of my worst enemy in a lot of ways, in that for me, like the sonic quality of the sentence matters so much that sometimes the sentence means nothing. There were many sentences in Bestiary that sounded in my head so kind of musical, or just like, yeah, melodic in a certain way. But when I was like actually reading the sentence, I was like, it's a kind of empty. So for me, it's always this struggle and balance of, I have a very kind of maximalist approach to the page when it comes to language, layering metaphor, layering simile, kind of following the sounds of words rather than thinking about what they literally mean, which I guess is kind of coming from, yeah, the way I was writing poetry. And then I have to kind of counterbalance that tendency as well, but that comes out more in revision, of like, yeah, understanding what feels like self-indulgent and what feels, yeah, like it's kind of the pulsing heart of the book. Yeah.
Is there ever a time, though, when the sound of the words themselves contributes to meaning or enhances meaning, or there is meaning within the style itself? Do you find that happening as you write?
Yeah, for sure. That's like when those are the ones that I keep. Like, that's when I know that the language is leading me to somewhere really productive and generative. And those are the sentences that remain. And then, yeah, the part where I have to kind of go back and cull are the parts where, yeah, I kind of get lost in my own language, if that makes sense. So it's both something that I think is, yeah, this incredible imaginative tool to use language in, I think, a very irreverent and playful way, which is what I loved about poetry, was this kind of, yeah, this ability to kind of make your own language, make something entirely new, which I loved. And then on the flip side, there's that other part of myself that I have to kind of wrestle with. Yeah.
Influences as both a poet and a prose writer.
Mm.
What's your balance between reading poetry and prose? And do you find one is more influential to you than the other?
Mm. Yeah, I think I read about the same amount. Like, I tend to read like the same number of poetry and prose books, but I think often I think it really depends to like what I'm obsessed with at the moment and what I'm trying to grapple with. Like recently I've been reading a lot of flash fiction, which I think is that perfect kind of crossover between prose and poetry, because I'm very interested in the flash fiction form. And yeah, the blending, always things that are multi-genre too are really interesting to me. And like, I also have noticed that like whenever I'm on social media, like I notice a lot of prose writers read a lot of poetry, and that always makes me so like thrilled and excited to see that there is this kind of like cross-disciplinary or like erasing of those boundaries. Yeah, I feel like poetry is what I turn to whenever my language I start to feel like I'm being predictable, or I can kind of tell like where my sentences are going, which is not as fun, is I go to poetry to be surprised again, I think. Yeah.
We talked with DC author Rian Amilcar Scott, and was once a poet and is now purely a prose writer. I'll not say purely, I can't speak for him. Maybe he has some journals somewhere. But he's only publishing that I know prose. But I think he reads a poem a day. And like he says, you know, if you're a prose writer, read a poem a day. It's such a helpful thing. What would you say to a prose writer who says they don't read poetry?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I empathize because I understand the kind of like teaching that we get in America of like that poetry is some kind of really antiquated, dull, like purely pastoral art form. But yeah, I would just say, like, for me, poetry is like the boundaries of language. You know, it's where language is broken and put together in new and strange ways, and it's where all that language making happens. I feel like it's where all these possibilities are revealed, and there's just something about, I don't know, the compression of language too that I think can be so powerful to learn from. Yeah.
Best thing I ever did as a prose writer was go through still, but especially a huge poetry kick once, like just that binging for whatever period of time that was, measured in years. Still regularly read poetry, but that was such a helpful, like again, like you said, they're honed in so specifically on language in a way that prose writers aren't always. Anyway, I love. One thing I want to mention to the audience, we absolutely welcome questions. If you have a question throughout the rest of the chat, please just type it into the chat window. I will keep an eye on the chat window and get to as many of the questions that pop up as possible. So just please keep them coming. I have my own questions I'll keep asking in the meantime, but I'm happy to interrupt my questions for yours. So please ask away. So I did want to talk a little bit about writing violence. And this is my content warning for violence, because I don't want, we're going to talk about violence briefly, hopefully not too directly or specifically, but the craft of writing about it, I think this novel is if you want to study it, this is a novel to read and study how this is written about. So one of the words I saw in at least two in the Kirkus review, and I think in Julia Phillips' review too, they both, or the blurbs were, they used the word visceral. And I imagine that that's a word that it's going to get used a lot for this book, because it's a very visceral experience. You feel this book as you read it. And part of that is there's violence in the book on several scales, but sort of just a casual violence within a family or relationship structure. The characters hurt and abuse each other. They hurt themselves, they're hurt by existence. And so just masterful writing of hurt. And also you write bruised, gross bodies just in this amazing, unflinching, but they're both gross and beautiful. Anyway, I don't know how it happened yet. So I'll write this essay later. I'll go through the book and figure it out. But how do you approach writing the body, especially the injured body?
Yeah, no, thank you for asking this question. I think it's really difficult because I didn't want to aesthetize, and make it turn into an aesthetic in a way that felt very exploitative or like overly beautiful, which I think happens, and I always have a kind of visceral reaction to that. But at the same time, I did want to use language in a way that was really also regenerative. And I think beauty is also, there's something very reparative about using language. So it was always a constant balance. Yeah, and I think with the violence too, like the way it is in the book is that it's so entwined with love and tenderness, which kind of makes it extremely messy and complicated, and trying to the fact that they're so inextricable. And that was something that thematically I was really interested in too, of having these kind of twin inheritances of love and violence that are so entwined with one another that they almost become inseparable. And what does it mean to kind of perpetuate that legacy, or to decide to take an alternative path from that? Yeah, and I still, like, whenever I look back, I always think, oh, would I have written it differently? Like, how would I have changed this? Would I have like held back? And I think that's another thing, is that it's almost like I needed to go through that process of writing so shamelessly almost, to kind of, I mean, not that it's like catharsis or release or anything like that, because I think that's oftentimes what like people assume, when it really is like craft and work that goes into everything. But yeah, it's just like I didn't hold back from what I wanted to look at deeply. And it's something that when I look back, I'm like, wow, that was very unique to the process of writing this book. Yeah.
Is there anything specifically you did to avoid gratuitousness though? Is it really it never felt to me, at least as a reader, like you were violent for violence sake. It wasn't an action movie. Obviously it wasn't an action movie. It wasn't that kind of just gratuitous violence. Was there anything you cut that felt that way? Was it a revision process to make sure you didn't take something further than you were comfortable with, or you thought a reader might be comfortable with?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because I wanted violence in some way to be kind of the marrow of the book, because so much, again, with intergenerational trauma, it is this inheritance of not only receiving violence, but the capacity to inflict it. So I knew it was important that it wasn't purely just to kind of, show I can describe this and have like excessive, blood or anything like that. Because that would, I didn't want it to turn into like some kind of action movie. I love action movies, but I didn't want it to seem like, like anything like that. But I think the parts that I ended up cutting away were actually parts about the grandfather. There was the original essay that I wrote for the book, which, I wrote when I was a teenager too. So it's been something I've worked on for a long time. that was like the heart of the book for so long. And I remember it was so difficult. My last edit was actually cutting that section out. It was like a good 15,000 words. And it was so difficult for me because to me, that was, the origin of the book. I'm like, this is the piece that kicked off everything else. But I remember thinking that, I remember like telling myself, like, I was like this is very dramatic. I was like laying in bed. I was like staring at the ceiling and I was thinking, how would I feel if this were published? Like if this 15,000 word section were in the book, like how would I feel? And I remember just thinking I would feel really sad in a lot of ways because I think that the gaze in that section of the book was exploitative. It was kind of looking at somebody's body in this way that felt just so objectifying. And I realized it was because I had written it at a time where it was just not quite there. And I was like, okay, this does need to go. And I ended up revising it and it was published elsewhere in a completely different form, completely rewritten. And the spirit of I think that like love and tenderness was in there. But yeah, I just realized I was like, oh, there's something about the gaze. And like almost like this person has been kind of reduced to something. And I wanted to use language in a different way to kind of revive and resurrect and make things more alive rather than the opposite of like objectifying, turning a character entirely passive, which is what was happening in that section that I ended up cutting. Yeah.
You hinted this a little bit. I'm wondering then, the opposite of what you're saying is what's appealing, for lack of, that's not the right word, but about the details of the injured body. Why focus the reader's attention to it? What do you look for in the language of writing about that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think like for me, writing is always, it feels like a very transformative process. It always feels somewhat magical. And maybe that's why I kind of always use literal magic. But to me, just like, I mean, metaphor itself is magic. Like to say something is something else. Like it's an act of alchemy just to use a metaphor. And so everything's kind of speculative in my mind. So I think for me, that focus on injury, like the tiger tail literally grows out of an injury that's like on her butt, essentially. It grows out of this wound. And so I was kind of connecting like the woundedness to, I wanted to kind of transform that and not just, again, like this idea of a wound being this very passive thing. And then the characters themselves being like entirely passive or like victims. I was interested of like if healing isn't possible, what is possible? If it's not possible to kind of, be completely, to erase this, like if you have to kind of carry this bodily legacy of violence and all of these inherited wounds, like what is possible beyond perpetuating it? And I think that's why I was so kind of obsessed and focused. On their embodiedness and also their physical bodily transformations. Yeah.
So going more broadly from the details of violence to details in general, how do you select or discover details? Because it's just, I mean, you're to me, I just like the detail choosing and selection was on point throughout. So I was really pleased to read every detail that came up. How do you select or discover details?
Wow, sorry, ignore, there's the phone ringing. Ignore any sounds. It's not coming from you, it's coming from me. I'm really happy that that was the reading experience, because one thing I really struggle with is I tend to not have a kind of like hierarchy of importance when I write. Everything tends to be like one level, and oftentimes it's a very like extreme level, because in my mind, everything is important. Every single thing is important. I don't have a hierarchy. And sometimes that can create like a real sense of energy in the writing. And sometimes it makes everything feel not important. And that's what I was really afraid of. So I think for me, again, it's always in the revision process rather than in the writing process. It was about, I think in some ways, like understanding what will resonate with you, like what details will resonate with each other. If this specific image or item or brand is being mentioned and it's like recurring again, like what do all those resonances mean? Like what do they accumulate into? I think that helped me a lot, is like thinking about accumulation and how each like detail, image, metaphor will kind of accumulate throughout, either a section or the whole book. Yeah.
All right, to the chat window. So our first question is, admittedly, as a prose writer, I am savoring the richness of the language of your book. Could you share about a moment where the language led the narrative for you? I think that's what you were saying before. You said that you go back to the language when you're feeling too predictable. So share a moment where the language led the narrative.
Yeah, I really feel like, for me, it always leads the narrative, no matter what I'm doing. But I can kind of give an example, maybe not, well, I guess from the book. I think all of the grandmother sections, which are kind of in this like prose poem style that have like these gaps in them, these spaces, these like ghostly presences. I think in those sections, that was very voice driven. So I remember starting each letter. I wrote all the letters at one time, and they were kind of like clumped together in the book at a certain point before being kind of scattered. And I remember thinking, I have no idea what she has to say. Like, I'm like, I have no idea what she's thinking. I have no idea like what is motivating her, nothing. But as soon as I started writing the letters and kind of realizing it was coming from this like mythopoetic place, I let the language lead me. And it wasn't so scary or intimidating. And I think in some ways I realized like that idea of like, oh, I don't know anything about her. I don't know what she wants. Like those were all false questions, because she wants to be unknowable. And the way that the letters are formatted too, I think kind of resist a very easy reading of them. Like they kind of require a lot of pausing, a lot of parsing, a lot of kind of confusion, and I wanted to play into that, because I was like, oh, what I realized about her is that she's never going to tell you, she's never going to let you know anything in this kind of very direct, straightforward way. And that was, led by the language, by metaphor, by image. Yeah.
I love those sections too, because in a way they announce themselves visually. The second you turn to the beginning of that chapter, the appearance on the page is different of anything. The first one of those that appears, it looks different than anything you've encountered in the book before. So it's also just, and which almost feels poetical too, that the shape of the poem on the page has its own meaning into it too. So it was like a reset. It was a really great reset.
Yeah.
It was like, oh, it's almost like I better pay attention extra again because something has just changed. So that was, those are, maybe I'll try to, when you're answering that, maybe I'll try to find one and pull it up so I can hold it up for the camera.
Yeah.
So the next question, a practical process question. When working on the first draft, did you try to hit a daily word count?
This is a great question. I didn't, but that was because, well, I always tell people too that I kind of like tricked myself in the writing process. So I, again, was kind of beginning with this really small micro memoir piece, and I started expanding that, and then I would just finish a piece and then continue. And because I wasn't thinking about cohesion, I wasn't like, okay, so these 10 pages are the first 10 pages of a novel, or etc. I would just, kind of, again, it was like an essay collection. So I would just finish each section. And then I wouldn't think about, oh, do they go together? Should they be compiled? Should I publish them separately? I just tried to avoid thinking about that. And mainly because I didn't know what I was doing, because I was a very like amateur prose writer, and it felt great to be to be an amateur and to feel like a beginner, and to not have these expectations for myself. And so it was like it was like a mind trick almost, because by the end of that whole process, I had like a manuscript length piece of work, but I just hadn't yet thought of it as a whole, or didn't let myself think about it as a whole, because it was very intimidating. And I also let myself go at a pace. So there was a point where I was just like, didn't touch anything for a month, and then would go back to a piece, or I would sit down and write all the letters and then not look at anything else. So it was a very kind of erratic process, but I also know that at the time I had like 2 jobs and was also going to school. So part of it was just also, like snatching weekends and moments to write. And so that's part of what made it so hectic. But I think now actually I have a little bit more of a routine. I'm just not working toward like a cohesive whole. Because I think for me, that immediately like scares me off. So I always just think, oh, I'll go in and touch one sentence, and then you end up like writing 2 pages. Yeah.
You covered the next question, which is a follow-up there as you answered. Just real quickly, I did pull up, let's see if I can get that. You can't quite see it, but if you notice in the pages there, there's basically extra gaps. You can see the wide white spaces in the lines. So when you get to the grandmother sections, that's sort of what they look like. And it's not a huge change, but it's the second, I mean, you see it the second you turn to those pages. I mean, the second you turn the page, the first, like something has altered, and it's a really great experience. So what would you tell a nonfiction writer who wants to try writing fiction? And I said, run away now. No, that's great, do it. Yeah.
Oh, okay. This is the perfect question for me because I wrote Bestiary as an essay collection. And it was only after it was acquired that it became a novel. So for the longest time, it was nonfiction. So that's perfect. And I didn't know the difference actually, because at the time that I was calling it nonfiction, there was a tail growing, there were flying people. So clearly my idea of nonfiction would probably be a little different than what other people had to say. Yeah, I would say I'm not someone who's very experienced with like essay writing or memoir writing, even though I did try to write essays that turned into fantasy, clearly. I would say they're probably, I feel like it depends on the person. But I guess I wouldn't be too intimidated because what kind of intimidated me when I was first thinking about fiction and a novel was like, oh, I don't know how to plot. Like, I don't know how to write dialogue. I don't know all of these like rules. I don't know how to structure. Like I, would write something that was a page long. Like I don't know how to do any of those things. But I realized that I don't think that many people, while they're like in the actual process of writing, are thinking of, or maybe some people are, and that's brilliant. They're like, I know exactly where this is going. Like this is part of my rising action. But I just kind of tried to not think about those technical aspects and to fixate on them so much of like what's qualified to be fiction. Yeah, and instead to just kind of follow my own obsessions and impulses. Yeah, and just like have trust that it will go somewhere and not be too hard on myself if it doesn't. So those are like probably the things that I needed to tell myself back then. Yeah.
I always feel like too that when I'm writing nonfiction as a primarily fiction writer, I'm like, I always reach a point where, God, I wish this had happened instead.
Yeah.
This would be so much better in terms of story.
Yeah.
So that I'm always limited in the other direction. Like, no, you can't make that up, Zach. You have to write the real thing.
Yeah, well, I think that's part of what made it when I realized that it was a novel and not essays too, was I was just like, well, I'm gonna just make the number of aunts different. And I was like, wait a second. I'm like immaculate conceiving people left and right. Like this needs to be a different, have a different ethical expectation. Yeah.
All right. This is another question from the chat. I attended a talk with another Poet Cum prose writer, the wonderful Ocean Vuong, and he said that he deliberately didn't feel tied to the story arc. Did you find that freedom, or did you realize you had a story arc after all?
Yeah, I mean, what's really brilliant about Ocean Vuong is that he used a different kind of non-Western structure for his novel. It's a Japanese form, actually, and it's like a four-part form. And rather than, so basically the idea is like Western novels focus on conflict. Again, I'm like Wikipedia reciting it because I did research on this form because I was interested in the way that he used it. So this idea that like in Western novels, we typically think of it being centered on conflict, and conflict is the thing that drives the book. And then in this Japanese form, this kind of very ancient form, it's actually proximity that propels the book, or it creates the structure for the book. And I really loved that. And I was like, oh, what would it mean, for example, for like the queer love story to not be conflict driven? And so purposefully, it is not conflict driven. I actually remember getting notes on people being asked, like, why isn't there more conflict between them? And I was like, it's on purpose, I promise. I was also really interested in, proximity driven narrative. And I think that spirit comes out a bit especially in the first half, where you kind of meander through these different characters' lives, and then they kind of tie together at the end. rather than being like, oh, okay, immediate conflict, here's what needs to, yeah, here's what's driving. But yeah, I mean, I definitely felt, yeah, felt the need to like structure it in a way that I was like, oh, it has to be paced like a thriller. It has to, you know, I have to have a climax. And I did end up kind of having these like pseudo micro climaxes throughout the book. But I just realized that I was trying to force it into a shape that it would just never be, and that was never part of its ethos, or not why I wrote it in the first place. And then I started to feel more of that freedom. Yeah.
I think it's really great that so much attention is being drawn to non-story arc narrative again. Just not these stories I think have existed forever, but
Mm-hmm.
we really got focused on creating story arcs so much within the world of creative writing, whatever that is. Um, I've been researching illness narrative. And one of the things with illness narrative is that they really want this triumph story of you get sick, you reach the worst part, then you get better. But that's an atypical illness narrative. That's not how most people end up experiencing illness. And so that it's actually harmful. There's an ethical discussion of how the narrative structure forced on illnesses is actually harmful to people who are trying to cope with illness, because it tells them there should be this thing when actually that's not the thing they usually experience. So I also find it interesting from that perspective too.
Yeah, I mean, what's also interesting too is that I think we consider certain narrative patterns to be kind of natural or correct. You know, the hero's journey, that more classic like curved plot structure. But those are constructs in the same way that, like, you know, that 4-part Japanese structure is a construct. And in fact, it's probably even more constructed because our lives don't follow don't follow the hero's journey, which I wish. I really wish it would. And so yeah, I think we've kind of canonized certain things as like, oh, this is, anything else is unconventional. And I'm like, but listen, those other forms are like thousands of years old. So it's not that, you know, that the, like, you know, Ocean Vuong's book is like the most unconventional thing. It's just that it's drawing from a different tradition that's just as yeah, just as valid, and just a different construction. Yeah.
I experience a full hero's journey every day. It's every day from start to finish. That's what I do now. So another question from the chat. I've been really curious. You know how they say that every person you meet leaves an impression on you, and those imprints make their way into the writing, intentionally or not. And then you said it's a memoir piece. So are there any echoes or aspects of people you met maybe once or twice that just had a singular glance at in your book?
Oh, this is a really interesting question. Yeah, well, the piece that was originally the memoir piece that I wrote ended up being completely cut from the book and published elsewhere. So there definitely isn't kind of that remnant of the initial draft in there. But I would say when I was writing The Family, there were certain details that felt that kind of haunted me and came out subconsciously in the writing. Like I remember there's one section where I like described the mother as having very pale eyes, the kind of like sap colored eyes. And I remember that there's kind of like this family trait of like eyes that look almost nocturnal, like kind of yellowish and glowing. And I remember thinking, oh, that's so tiger-like. That's kind of like the predatory glow that I think the daughter fears. And so that detail ended up being in the book to describe the mother's eyes. So there were little details like that I think like are mythologized that ended up in the book. But I wouldn't say like overtly like there are specific people that I can kind of like track in the book that they're modeled after. Like I think yeah, nothing as kind of transferable as that. Yeah.
So did you feel any emotions while writing your characters in your book? I know I had instances from the chat. I know I had instances where I would feel some strong emotions about the characters I write, whether it's sadness or happy. So any particular emotions associated with particular characters?
Oh, that's really interesting. I mean, I find myself often like really frustrated with my characters. And those frustrations often mirror the frustrations I have with myself. So that's always like a bit of a like psychological thing. But yeah, I think I'm often really drawn to characters who are witnesses in some ways, who are people who have a desire to intervene in the kind of chaotic atmosphere that they're in, but aren't sure how to. And so oftentimes, like when I'm writing in that space, I feel that sense too, of like being an eye at the center of a storm. And I think the strong desire is something that I feel too, and try to channel. Yeah, but it's kind of hard too, because I almost feel like yeah, it's almost like I kind of lose awareness while I'm writing. And so I'm not sure until later when I reread, and those are when the emotions usually arise.
Chat again. I often feel constrained and silenced by conventions around language. Are there any exercises that you do to let yourself play with and rediscover language?
Oh yeah, I love this question. I think also maybe a little bit meta, but the book is kind of a book about language as well, because I know there are moments like Ben, talks about being in ESL class and like kind of making fun of all the grammar that she has to learn and consume. So yeah, I think being irreverent, I think like for me too, like drawing from my multilingual background sometimes is really helpful as well. I love to kind of estrange language from myself. I love to take aphorisms that I know in other language and then other languages and translate them into Chinese or translate them into English and listen to how kind of strange and beautiful they sound and channel that voice into my writing. Yeah, I think like defamiliarizing from language it's always been really helpful for me. And oftentimes poetry does that. It kind of estranges you from like meaning, but you see the word or the language in all these different ways. Yeah, so I would say that. I mean, I have like a running document of just like sayings that my mom says that I translate literally in my head, so like it'll be like, what's a favorite one? She loves saying, "You don't have to eat the pig to know it walks," which is an aphorism, or like "Don't hang yourself on a tree," which is like "Don't shoot yourself in the foot." But in Chinese, it's "Don't hang yourself on a tree," which I thought was so morbid, and so I wrote it down. And so I just had this like running document of these things, and it always kind of excites me to go back to them. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's what I do.
Great. I think too, just like I always, occasionally I grab a book that that it looks good, but I'm not that interested in.
Mm,
Because if I'm not that interested, it's probably doing something outside my main center. And that helps me
mm.
sometimes like get back and like rediscover my center, but also push beyond my center. So this is a follow-up to something you said earlier. I've learned how they use Kisho Tenketsu in Japan. Is the proximity idea tied to that? If you know, can you recommend how to learn more about this proximity writing structure?
Oh yeah, this is related to Ocean's book, right? I believe that's the form that Ocean Vuong uses. Um, yeah, well, one book that has been really helpful for me, I mean, definitely reading more in this particular structure, I think could be really useful, but, or even mapping out stories that like I remember I was reading a blog post of someone like taking a short story from like the New Yorker and breaking it down in this particular structure. But one book that I really love is called Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio by Pu Songling. And it's a collection of basically ghost stories. And they're very short. Some of them are just a paragraph long. Some of them are like 2 pages long. But what I love about it is they completely defy any sort of predictable structure. So the story will be like, okay, this man was at an inn and he ate their pancakes and he turned into a pig. And then he got put into a pig pen and realized all the guests at this inn had eaten those pancakes and turned into pigs. Then the police showed up, or not the police, but kind of like the ancient equivalent of like lawmakers show up and say, you can't do that. And then the story will end with like, after the innkeeper was executed, this happened. You're like, whoa, wait a second. Like, something is missing from this story. Something is there that shouldn't be there. It did not end where, and it's just so unconventional and so delightfully strange. Like, there were so many moments where I put down the book and I was like, this is so strange. And it's illustrated too with illustrations from like the 1500s. So that's also a delight. So yeah, I go to that book and I think it makes me feel a little bit more irreverent towards certain structures. And yeah, will help, I feel like for me, like opens up all of the possibilities. Yeah.
Mhm. So again, from chat, what are your thoughts on translating other languages for the reader versus keeping the language intact on its own?
Mm. Um, yeah, I mean, I think for me, there are certain words that I just can't imagine ever translating. And so I always kind of keep those preserved, especially like names that you would call people. I like kind of never think about translating them. But then there are other things where I actually prefer how they sound translated. I just think, yeah, it's kind of like a little bit jarring in ways that I enjoy or sounds kind of poetic. And I think one of them is like, in the book, there's a lot of talk of like horse oil cream, and that's a very common, horse oil is like a very common product in a lot of like cosmetics. And I just loved how it sounded. I was like, horse oil, like it sounds so bizarre, and I love how it sounds. And so I translated, I put that in English, horse oil throughout the book. So I think I think that's part of the joy too of like translating, is that you can kind of yeah, choose, and it doesn't have to be systemic, because I think like none of us are really professional translators. So I didn't have to think, well, it's inconsistent for me to translate this but not translate this. I could kind of just do it however I wanted, and to my own kind of personal yeah, to my own personal way of speaking. So there was a lot of freedom in that. So yeah, I would just say like kind of go with your instincts. And there may be pressure to be like, oh, you should use words that are more recognizable, but yeah, if it's important to you, then I think, yeah, wanting to like preserve that. Yeah.
So one of the things I want to talk about, and we have a little time left, is myth making
Mm,
and imagination. Because one of my favorite things about the novel is how there's myth at all scales. The whole
mm,
novel is itself a myth. Each chapter, for the most part, is a told myth or one lived by the characters. There's a rehashing of a myth, a lived myth by the
mm-hmm,
characters, or sometimes both at the same time. Sometimes a myth is recounted in a few paragraphs. Sometimes a bit of a myth claims only a part of a sentence. There's all these little moments of myth making. Um, so I guess broadly, first, what's the role of imagination in your work? How much is
mm,
imagination? How much is drawing from past myths or whatnot?
mm. Yeah, I think for the myths in the book, the kind of very broad structure and themes, or not themes, but like, yeah, the broad structure, the characters of them are, yeah, are drawn from myths that I've heard orally told to me. And I think the desire to kind of subvert or twist them and reimagine them are when kind of imagination comes in as this tool. And I think part of it is um, there is something like really incredibly cosmically powerful about revising a creation myth or an origin myth. It feels the stakes feel high in a really like glorious cosmic way of like, what would it mean for these characters to be like literally remaking the world or imagining their own origins? It's just like, so yeah, it's so powerful to me. um and then the other thing is, I think yeah, like it for me, like myth is not something, I think we tend to think of myth and folklore as very antiquated and as of the past, like, you know, quaint and old fashioned. And for me, like these myths and fables were paths into futurity, into, yeah, the possibility of a future, and are so tied to kind of those elements of inventing oneself and like, yeah, creating a narrative for oneself that yeah, I think we're really tied to their futures as well.
How do you find imagination working with or against or alongside history and memory or shared
Mm.
memories from family?
Yeah, I mean, that's another really difficult thing, is I didn't want to mythologize Homeland in this way that feels very kind of familiar and trite and can be very objectifying too. I think there's a huge tendency, and I'm someone who's like writes as part of a diaspora, to want to kind of mythologize things that erase or don't take into account like people's actual lived experience. You know, like that Taiwan isn't just this mythical land, it's like a literal place where people are living and working and struggling and doing and like having fun and all of these things. And so um it's very difficult to kind of entwine history and myth in a way that doesn't reduce like the actual bodily physical consequences of history. And so I knew that no matter what I wanted to do, like I needed to kind of always center the body and center experiences and kind of the impact of inheriting these histories, and not to use myth to turn something into a fairy tale, or to kind of neaten the narrative in the way that, you know, like a government's narrative of history would try to do, is kind of package an account. So it was like, okay, I need to make room for porousness and also, yeah, for lived experience. Yeah.
Myth do for the writing itself, like on a language level? Is there something like a mythic language or something that you tap into to discover is new, or new words literally introduced? Is there something, for lack of a better word, fun about writing in this genre?
Oh, it's incredibly fun. And I think part of the reason why it's fun is that the characters get to take on these like deified personas. Like I always joke that I feel like Ben in the character is like a god, like she's like a trickster god, and all they have like these kind of deity archetypes in my head while I was writing them as well. I just love kind of the grandmother's harnessing that very kind of godly language. And she's like, I created, I created you, you are going to listen to me. And I think that can be really kind of terrifying. And in a lot of ways, yeah, also a kind of defense mechanism for the grandmother. But yeah, there's something really like ecstatic and playful, I think, about harnessing like the language of like cosmology, and to go really, really, really macro. Because I think as writers, we're really focused on how grounding and important like the very specific concrete details are. And sometimes like I want to do the opposite, which is like disorient and kind of take the ground out from underneath myself. And I think being in that mythic space, mythic language, can be really disorienting in a really pleasurable and also like generative way. Yeah.
Time for this final question from the chat, which is, can you tell us what your micro memoir was about?
Oh yeah, I mean, I already described what the piece was about. It was about like a grandfather character in the book, and it was kind of, it was like the capstone of the book. But what was really interesting about when I wrote that piece was, I showed it to my professor, Rachel Eliza Griffiths, and I remember her telling me, oh, what's really interesting about this piece of work is the women. It's not actually the patriarch. Because in my mind, I was like, I'm writing a story about a patriarch, the patriarch of the family, this grandfather figure. And she was saying, oh no, what's really interesting is the way that the women respond to them. And I remember in future classes, I was also told like, oh, the men in your books are only interesting in the way that the women react to them, which I thought was hilarious. I was like, oh, I see, like I'm writing these characters in order to kind of show the women that are around them. So in kind of removing his section of the book too, I kind of was able to like center and really kind of intentionally be like, this book is about these 3 generations of women. Yeah, so that was what that section was. That it was actually published in Apogee. It was called Ghost Fathered. So if you wanna look it up online and read it, if that's interesting, it's there. Yeah.
Well, I forgot the most important piece of information in my introduction, which is maybe now a good time to mention, even a better time, which is, if you have not yet read this book, you should buy a copy from your local independent bookstore. If you don't have easy access to that, I'm putting the link to the book on bookshop.org, that helps independent bookstores with their sales. If you've already read the book, you should buy a copy for a friend. We're close enough now to the holiday season, I can push gift giving sales. So absolutely buy a copy of the book for yourself, buy a copy for everyone you know. It's a fantastic, fantastic thing. K-Ming, I had a very long day today and it's ended in delight. So thank you for coming here and talking to me. It's been great.
Thank you.
Yeah. And we'll be back again soon. So please check the Writers Center website, the events tab, for all our events coming up. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much for these beautiful and insightful questions. So much I'm going to continue thinking about. And thank you for everyone in the chat too, who have been putting their questions. I've loved answering all of them and getting to chat with you all. Thank you.